Three, two, one.
Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me again today. I really appreciate it. And Steve, thank you so much for making the drive. I know that the weather wasn't ideal, so I really do appreciate it.
No problem.
So, just kind of what we spoke about on the phone, Chuck, I think is going to be, just revisiting those topics. Um, I'd love for you to start sort of at the beginning where you explain to me the history of the island. The tropes that were there during your time weren't the first to be there, and that there had been a history before this. I don't think a lot of people understand that and know that. They don't realize that Alcatraz was more than the prison before that.
Sure. The best I can determine, based upon the records that are available today, is in 1854 or thereabouts, the first lighthouse was created on Alcatraz Island. That was the very first structure, very first families that lived there was in 1854. After that, by 1859, it was a fort, a military fort, Fort Alcatraz. And of course, that was just prior to the Civil War, so there was quite a few things happening. It turned out to be a coveted spot for West Point graduates because many of those went on to become very famous people. Then sometime after, I can't tell you the exact amount of years, but it became a military disciplinary prison. And for about 75 years or so, it was under Army occupation, military disciplinary prison. There were families and family members as well as various categories of inmates living there. Which brings us up to 1934, when the Bureau of Prisons took over Alcatraz Island. And that was because the Army had abandoned it. They no longer needed it. They wanted to go elsewhere. So by 1934, the Bureau of Prisons decided to make an experiment about Alcatraz, and they created what is now known as the Alcatraz Island Bureau of Prison years from 1934 to 1963 when it closed. So that's just a general background of everything that happened there. But the point is that over 150 years there have been people living there.
And so now let's go to your specific story. How is it that your family came to live there? Kind of walk me through your father's family. How many people were involved in the prison systems, and your finally coming to Alcatraz.
Okay, well, in 1934, when the island was opened as a Bureau of Prisons, my uncle and my father and other family members were officers in Leavenworth Penitentiary. And my uncle was assigned the duty to come out and help open the island. He lived there about 8 or 9 months. He had 2 children at the time that he brought with him, and he helped open the island. Then he went back to Leavenworth Penitentiary. In 1939, my father was transferred to Alcatraz from Leavenworth, and he came out with my older sister, and I wasn't born at that time, but they came out to San Francisco, and he immediately went to work in the last part of 1939 on Alcatraz. It was difficult to get accommodations on the island. They were very, very limited, and they did want staff to live there. In later years, there was approximately 60 families, 100 kids. But at that time, the accommodations were rather limited. So it took my father and my mother and my sister until the last part of 1940, which would be sometime in the fall, before they were able to get accommodations on Alcatraz. At that time, I was about 4 months old. So that's my first encounter with Alcatraz. As time went on, World War II came along, and many, many officers re-enlisted. My father, being 40 years old and having served in the Marines in 1919, he re-enlisted. Many officers did the same thing, and we had to leave Alcatraz in 1943 when he went back into service. When the war ended in 1945, he immediately got his position back on Alcatraz, and he went back to work there in 1945. But it took another 3 years before we were able to move back to Alcatraz. My sister by this time had married, so I was the only sibling to come back to Alcatraz in 1948. In 1949, the uncle I mentioned from Leavenworth came back to Alcatraz as a captain. He left Alcatraz as an associate warden in 1952. Also, a cousin from Leavenworth came to Alcatraz with him in 1949. So I had cousins, family members, and so forth living there until they left about 1952. My father retired in 1953, and so I left the island between 13 and 14 years of age. And that's my history. Left there in the middle of 1953, which is, 65 years ago this year. So we're talking something quite a ways in the past.
And can you speak to just the atmosphere there? I know that when we talked on the phone previously, you mentioned that you felt this was most similar to growing up on a military base. Can you talk a bit about that and why that would be so?
Yeah, I've kind of learned that over the years in giving talks. When the Park Service opened Alcatraz Island in 1973, they had kind of a structured system that went through the island. I went there with my father there a few months after it opened just to get his viewpoint. But by 1988, we'll say, the latter part of 1980s, the Park Service found our Alcatraz Alumni Association. I don't know why it took that long, but they finally found us. We had actually formed in 1965, and so by 1988, we'd been a group for a long time. They invited us back to the island for the anniversary in August, along with former inmates, which was interesting for me too, because it was the first time I made first-person contact with the inmates. But in giving talks from that point on, which has been 30 years, I guess, now, I have come to find out that the people that relate to my family stories on Alcatraz the most are people that live on small military bases throughout the world, especially the United States. While we were in the middle of San Francisco Bay, many of these bases are in the middle of nowhere, and so they were very much like us. They relate, 60 families, 100 kids, and I became aware that, yeah, there was similarities throughout the world. We just happened to be in a unique location.
What was it like growing up there as a kid? Can you speak to the normality that you felt it was?
Well, as I've mentioned in a number of talks, that's usually a question that comes up. I, of course, at that age, when I was a baby, of course, I had very few memories of that. But when I went back at age 8 and on, it was just home. All our friends were there. I didn't consider it to be anything unique. Much to my regret, I didn't realize how good the view was until I went back in later years. But it was just home. Your friends were there. We didn't lock our doors. We had great Halloweens. We had Christmas parties. We had the get-togethers. I didn't know there was anything different until I moved off the island and found out that people lived differently than I did, except on these small bases maybe. So for me, in later years when I was giving talks, it became apparent that I was a very lucky person to have been able to live on that island and have those experiences.
And growing up there, can you just speak to daily life that you know, there was nothing out of the usual going on. Obviously, people were going about their day to day. There just happened to also be a prison right next door while you were, you know, playing and enjoying life on the island. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I guess, you know, as I tell people my stories, they relate to the fact that I said, imagine yourself being 10, 11, 12 years of age, and you're only living on 1/3 of the island. The other 2/3 was blocked off with signs saying, don't go here, stay out of there, danger. Well, for a 12-year-old boy, this is like a big searchlight saying, "Hey, what's there?" So in that respect, it became much more unique because as boys, we used to explore everywhere around the island. Fortunately, no one ever got badly hurt, even though one young kid fell off one of the cliffs, but he didn't get too badly hurt. So that was very exciting. I think any young boy would love to be in that situation. As far as the inmates were concerned, they were adults, and I don't know if you remember being a kid, but adults were adults. So you socialized with your other kids. And so I didn't really pay a lot of attention to them unless they were pointed out as being something special, which happened on occasion. Inmates used to pick up our white goods, like in the military, and do sheets and white goods and towels and things. And I used to help them load the trucks with the garbage. And that's about the only interplay I had with them.
For you growing up, it wasn't a question of, I think some people who are surprised to learn that children live on the island would also assume that there is fear there, but it sounds like that was not the case.
No. Did you say, Caitlin, there was a theater? What was the question?
Fear of as a child.
Oh, no, absolutely not. None of my friends, nor did I experience any kind of fear in relation to the inmates. It was pretty common knowledge among the parents, of course, that we were in a situation that could be dangerous. But the officers, my father included, never talked about their work. I mean, they just didn't talk about what they did. It only became apparent to me what was going on behind the scenes in later years when I was able to talk to other officers and former inmates as to what was happening behind the doors. But as a kid, that was not of concern.
Talking about exploring the things that you get up to as a young boy. I mean, anywhere, the kids will be kids, but especially in a place like that where there are so many nooks and crannies to be exploring. Can you talk a bit more about the things that you would get up to? And I'd love for you to also mention the fireworks story.
Oh, yeah, well, you had asked me about kind of events that I got involved with, and the fireworks story is just one of those classics. As a kid, you tried to get to where you shouldn't be, of course. We used to sneak by the guard towers and go to what was called the social hall, which was behind a fence that we were not supposed to be able to get through. In later years, I found out that we weren't as smart as we thought we were because I had a chance to go up into the top of the dock tower. And those guards saw us. They just didn't get excited because you could see everything. So while we thought we were getting away with a lot, we certainly weren't. But in the time I lived there, you could buy fireworks during the 4th of July in Chinatown in San Francisco. By the way, that's the way we connected to San Francisco. We went to school every day by boat and then home every day by boat. But in Chinatown, you could buy all the fireworks you wanted and more than we could use in a day. So a friend of mine and I thought it would be kind of fun to take a number of the bigger fireworks home with us, and we did. And that evening, he and I went out into the middle of the parade ground, which is where we lived, the 1/3 of the island where we lived. And in the middle of the night, created a very long fuse, lit the fuse, and went home. Well, when the fireworks went off, of course, there was a huge response. They had a great investigation. They called officers in. They interviewed people. They tried to determine who had done this dastardly deed. And I can always remember my father because I was there when they were talking to him. They said, "Well, where was Chuck?" And he says, "No, he wasn't part of it. He was in bed." And he told the truth, but I lit the fuse. It was a long fuse. That's just one of the kind of things you do.
That's a great story.
That's a fantastic story. And it never pinned on you. You never
No, No, Caitlin, as a matter of fact, my father to his dying day never knew that I lit the fuse. I never told him.
And the other thing that you had mentioned on the phone was, you know, the slingshots,
Oh,
the boats that will go by. Can you talk a bit about that?
yeah, well, the island was posted to be 200 yards away so that private boats, boats that toured around the island with tourists on it, you know, they were supposed to stay 200 yards away. And the way the towers were situated, most of the island they could not get within 200 yards without being seen. But on our side of the island, which is the Bay Bridge side of the island, the 1/3 of the island we lived on, we discovered that the boats could be drawn in closer. So the teenage girls at the time, we plotted that we would hide in the bushes and the whatnot that were around here and have the teenage girls draw the boats in. Well, you know, these guys in these big sailboats, they'd see the girls and they'd come in as close as they could. We'd jump out of the bushes with these Goliath slings and try our best to put a hole in their sails, because if you put a hole in and the wind hit it, it would go completely wrong. And well, that was kind of the things we'd think up to do. And of course, they had no recourse because they wasn't not supposed to be within 200 yards of the shore. So, you know, you think up these creative things to do.
What are some other stories that, you know, stick out in your mind as something that was unique and fun to have taken place on the island?
Well, you know, I've been asked what my favorite thing on the island was, and you know, the socialization, your friends and whatnot, it was not to be denied. It was great. But I didn't know till I left Alcatraz that there was such a thing as a game warden or that there was a limit to fishing. Because when I'd get home, I could go fishing off of Alcatraz. I had some favorite spots, and I can catch some terrific fish. Capizoni was one of my favorites, and catch shark and things like that. So for me, I was really disappointed when I lost that ability and we moved off the Alcatraz. So fishing was one of the things that was great for me. And I had one other little story that relates to San Francisco. In 64 building, which is the main building when you get off the dock that all tourists see, a big gray building, a holdover from the military years, it was converted so that 27 families could live in that, approximately 27 families would live in that building. There was 3 floors. In between each floor there was a crawl space, a rather large crawl space, maybe 2 feet. And anyway, as a kid you could get in there. My friend Bill of the Hart family, they lived on the 3rd floor. We found an access to that crawl space. And of course we opened the access by taking off the lock and whatnot and pulling the door down, and we went down between the floors. Oh, this is terrific for a 12-year-old or so, because you're peeking down into people's apartments and you know you're just really having a great time. But what I didn't realize, even though my friend Bill had warned me, don't get off the 2x4s. And inadvertently I forgot and I put my foot through the ceiling. Well, there were people there. And they started yelling. They didn't see my foot, but they started yelling because we're in San Francisco. Earthquake, earthquake. And it was a great hue and cry. People running around the building, earthquake, earthquake. We stayed hidden until all the hue and cry went down, went back out, put the door back on, and went into his house. And first thing they said was, "Did you feel the earthquake?" Well, I happen to know that in years later, we went back to that particular apartment, looked up, and the crack is still there.
Sounds like you got into some good trouble out there, but that you have an impressive record for not getting caught.
Oh, no, and unfortunately, there were a few of the older kids that did get caught doing some things, and you get called up before the warden or the captain, and they tell you this and tell you that and warn you that the officer, your father, could be fired. But it never happened, to my knowledge. No one ever got fired, and kids did kid stuff, and that's the way it was.
Can we go back to, would go on during those periods of time? What was the protocol?
Well, you know, as I mentioned to you on the phone, most of the real escape, there were 14 escape attempts in 29 years plus of Alcatraz. And many of them occurred in the first years from 34 to 42 or 3. And a number of them occurred in the last years when the prison was kind of changing its whole nature. All I can relate to is that when I moved back to Alcatraz in 1948 as 8, my sister would tell me the previous escapes that the rule was to go into your apartment or go into your living area and lock your door and wait until they all clear. That's if they blew the siren. I never experienced that. From 1948 to 1953, Warden Swope, who was the second warden on Alcatraz, there was no escape attempts. There was none. There were some riots in the cell block, which I can relate to. They're very much like the movies. You can stand outside the cell block and hear them banging cups against the bars and yelling and screaming and that kind of stuff. But the actual escape of prisoners, I didn't experience myself. My friends who did said it was really nothing. They went in their apartments and stayed locked up until everything was done. There was a fear that inmates would capture some residents and use them for hostage, but every single inmate that they talked to at length that tried to escape said that was never in their mind. They wanted to get off the island, and that's what they tried to do.
That makes sense. And I know that you said that you yourself hadn't had an experience with him, but obviously everyone, when they think of Alcatraz, they think of its most famous inmate, Al Capone. What do you know of the reception of him coming there and the interactions he had with the children of the guards?
Well, I can relate to what I've been told. Wanda Harrington Hart was a young girl, a lighthouse keeper's daughter that lived there actually prior to it becoming a Bureau of Prisons and later after it was a Bureau of Prisons. She told me a great story. When Al Capone arrived, he arrived with many, many other prisoners. They used rail cars throughout the United States and collected them at federal prisons, and they would bring them in the rail cars out to Tiburon, California, where there was a railhead. They put the rail cars on barges and brought the barges to Alcatraz and unloaded the inmates from the rail cars to the dock. I have pictures of this, and there was quite a few of them. Al Capone was number 85. Prior to that, there was only a half a dozen prisoners there when it first opened up, but when those rail cars arrived, it was an event. So people that lived on the island were well aware of this. And Wanda told me that her grandfather took her down to what we called the social hall and watched the inmates go by. I think they were in two columns of a couple people based upon the photographs. But she had Al Capone pointed out by her grandfather. Everybody wanted to see Al Capone. But my friend Rocky Chandler, who lived there at the time, he had the most unique experience. Rocky had asthma, and the treatment at the time was an adrenaline shot. And he had such a bad attack one day that his father took him up to the prison hospital. In the prison hospital, you could access it through a back door. You didn't have to go through the main cell block. And so his father took him up there, and there was a prisoner mopping the floor. And his father says, "Hey, Al, I want to introduce you to my son, Roy," at the time. And Roy tells the story. There's a great video clip of this, but I always kind of liked it because Roy was introduced to Al Capone. Al shook his hand. And as Roy tells the story, now this is 70 years later, so this man is in his 80s. He said, "I can still remember the warmth of that man's hand when I shook it." So there's a person that saw Al directly. Secondarily, there's some sidelight stories from my uncle who opened the prison and was there when Al arrived. My uncle is on videotape somewhere saying this story when he was asked. He said when he was in another room and Al was not close by, but you could hear him speak, you would have thought he was a woman. He said his voice was so high, it wasn't like, Rod Steiger or something from the movies. And I did some investigation on that, and sure enough, based upon what I found, there is no existing recording of Al Capone speaking anywhere, which is really kind of interesting because my uncle said his voice was very high. That's another Al Capone story.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that about him, that there's no recording of it.
Right. Based upon what I can find in this world where you have all this modern technology, maybe somebody can come up with one.
The other thing I wanted to touch upon for the video was your father's experience during the Battle of Alcatraz. Can you speak to the key nights and during those days?
Sure. Well, at that particular time, as I'd indicated before, we were living in San Francisco. Had to move off the island in 43. When my father went back to work there in 1945, he, of course, was there during this infamous escape where inmates got a hold of guns, which was considered to be impossible. Now, this is a rather interesting story, and anybody can look it up and read about what happened. But my father happened to be in the clothing room, which is one floor down below the main cell block. He had sent an inmate up to the main cell block because he had finished with his shower and his clothing. And the inmate immediately came back downstairs in a hurry and wouldn't tell my father what was going on. So my father went up to the cell block, took a look down the main block. He saw an inmate with a gun, and the inmate saw him, which was not a good thing. So my father ran back downstairs, closed the door behind him, and called in the alarm. It's a great story about how he had to call in twice before the alarm went off, but ultimately it did. He stayed 3 days and 2 nights in that clothing room area and the area below the kitchen with 18 inmates. And he was lucky to survive because there was thousands of rounds. There was Marines came and used grenades. There was tear gas. He looked terrible when he got home. But he managed to survive it. At that particular time, my mother became aware, so she took me, who was all of 6, and went down to the dock where we usually, where the boat came in and out of. It was full of people that were family members and whatnot for the guards that were on the island. And a boat came in, the Warden Johnson. And the reason I can cite this is that as a 6-year-old, certain things impress you. Well, that impressed me. The island was on fire in the middle of the night. There was lights, explosions, things going on. Very impressive. And as the boat came in, there was a body on the front covered by a sheet. Well, as a 6-year-old, you get interested in that too. And as the guards came off the boat, many of them were injured. There was an ambulance there, and many of the guards were injured. Bob Sutter came off. He had been shrapnel through his nose. And my mother asked him, "How's Ed doing?" My father, Ed. And he said, "Oh, he's doing great. He's okay. He's doing fine." And he went in the ambulance and took off. So the reason I mention this story is many, many years later, maybe 40 or 50 years later, I come across Bob Sutter at a reunion. And I brought this up to Bob. I said, that's one of my earliest memories. He says, "You remember what you said?" And I told him. And he says, "Oh, yeah, I told all the spouses the same thing." I didn't know what the hell was going on, but that's what I told them. That's history in the making.
And so now your dad is in this area with 18 inmates. Can you talk about what happened when he realized his son?
Well, as he told me the story, he said at the particular time, all the weapons they could carry with them in a cell block was a wooden club. You had no pistols or rifles or anything like that, no arms around prisoners. And in the hurry-scurry of what happened, he realized that his club was gone. And so there's a desk there that he used to sit at. He looked at these 18 inmates and he says, "Guys, I don't think you want to be involved with this. It's not going to come out right." And he says, "I want my club back." So he says, "I'm going to turn my back, and after a certain amount of time, I want to see my club on my desk." Sure enough, when he turned back, the club was there. Those 18 inmates did not get involved in the riot. And I says, "Well, what happened to those guys?" He says, oh, 17 of them got transferred back to the prison they came from. And that's the way Alcatraz worked. You transferred from another federal penitentiary to Alcatraz because you were doing something wrong. They wanted you to learn your lessons, so they sent you to Alcatraz. 17 of them, because of their lack of involvement and not hurting or killing my father, got sent back. I said, what about the 18th? He says, oh, that damn fool broke a rule before he got sent back, so he stayed.
Like any parent, especially back then, wouldn't talk about certain things with work. But what were the things that were impressed upon you when living there, or even not living there, with your father? I know you said that you were told don't hop him, don't jump out at him. What were some of? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, actually, based upon our earlier conversation, that's the one single thing that jumps out. He never talked about his work. I heard very little about what he did when I was a kid, unless he was around another guard or two and they were drinking. I could hear a few stories then. But the one thing he impressed upon me from the very, very early age is to never surprise him. Do not jump out. Do not surprise him under any circumstances. Well, he said it in such a way that I never did. So that's the single thing I can say about what he warned me about not doing. Now, other kids may have experienced different things, but my friends generally followed the same rule. Their fathers didn't talk about what they did, and we just lived our kids' life. In later years, when I went back and got to meet former inmates and former guards, I managed to put together a better picture about what went on both inside and outside. Opened as a prison, and this is a kindergarten class. I have photos of various classes from church. They had various age groups. Again, to give an idea, it was a very small village in the middle of the bay. This is another idea of what it was like there. Young kids on one of the Rodman cannons that was still there when I lived there. There were 3. And the top picture shows snow on the roof. That's the warden's house with snow in 1962. Doesn't happen very often in San Francisco Bay. And just because we mentioned the early days, I really like this kind of information here. This was from the 1890s. And if you can get a close-up by blowing it up, these are kids dressed in various kind of costumes in the 1890s on Alcatraz, which is totally different than my experience. At this particular time, this was at the infancy of motors, so they can go to and from San Francisco. These folks that lived there in the 1860s and 70s and 80s had a different existence than we did in modern times. That's pretty much it for some photos. No, it's a good question, Caitlin. As I mentioned earlier, when the Park Service asked us to come back to the island, I had just very close to retirement at that time. And I began to meet and get to know a whole lot of people that had lived there before and after me. And what I discovered was that the information was being lost. The stories, the photographs, the things that they had collected as family were being lost. So after I retired, my wife and I made it a point to go meet people that had lived on Alcatraz throughout the western states. And I collected stories and collected photos, and it just kept growing. And I did that for about 25 years. I'm still doing it a little bit now, but it's kind of overwhelmed me. This is just a sampling of trying to save the history of Alcatraz that I became aware of. In addition to that, I had my friend Steve do a a home movie of me on Alcatraz a number of years ago. I think it's 10 or 12 years ago. And it was just a home movie, one take, no documentary like some of the ones I've been on. And it turns out that has become kind of unique because the Park Service stopped you from being able to be out there when the public was there. And yet that was the most fun. I'd go out there, I'd tell stories, I'd gather a crowd and try to leave them with some feel of the island. So that's an outcome of that. My voice is beginning to go. We've been talking a long time. But that's become kind of unique now.
In the years you've been doing this, I think it's pretty abundantly clear that there is such a fascination with the island, with learning about the people that were there, being able to actually visit it. It's hands down one of the biggest attractions in this country. Why do you think there is such a fascination with Alcatraz?
Well, I've thought about that over the years because I've been asked. As I told you on the telephone, my son, who's a world traveler, he went a couple of years ago to the deep jungles of Venezuela and ran across some people down there that were locals, and they knew about Alcatraz, and that always amazed me because they were interested in Alcatraz from the deep jungles of Venezuela. So I've often thought that one of the reasons was Alcatraz was of interest was because it was secretive. When they opened it in 1934, everything was very secretive. So the media especially, is always interested in that. The few inmates that managed to serve their time on Alcatraz and go back to San Francisco told some stories and wrote some books. Secondarily, it's visible. That's the reason the Army left, was it's too visible. Everybody that comes into the Bay Area from anywhere in the world sees this rock out in the middle of the bay and they question what it's about. But the most powerful thing was Hollywood. Hollywood, from the very start, 1934 on, put movies with Alcatraz in their name. And they created what I think is the mystique of Alcatraz. For example, the Birdman of Alcatraz is total fictitious. Burt Lancaster was not able to meet Robert Stroud at the time. That's a great story about him trying to get to Alcatraz and meet him. But it's totally fictitious. But if I talk to people today that watch this movie, they don't believe what I tell them. Hollywood is very powerful.
I agree. Obviously, this is such a wide-reaching topic, and there's so many facts to cover. But for this piece specifically, are there any things that you want to make sure to note that I may not have asked you about that you want people to know?
No, I think I've telling Steve, I like to be a storyteller. I don't try to determine socially what Alcatraz was about and how it was and so forth. But one thing I try to leave with people, and I've been really successful, is that they can relate to it as a person and as people. It was not a mystery. It was a prison in the middle of San Francisco Bay. And as I tell my stories, people can relate both to the inmates and to the residents as people. And I just try to remove the mystery. It's a great study. I wish somebody else would look into the early years from 1860 to 70 and 80. It's been attempted, but very difficult. So what I'm trying to leave people with is that, hey, it was a great place to live. It was a great place to grow up. I have not met a single kid that grew up there that doesn't appreciate the fact that he was there. And that's kind of it.
Well, I so appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today and before this about this. And thank you so much for making the trip to make sure that this could be done as well. I think it's going to come out to be a very great piece, and that both of you, appreciate it so fully. Let's talk a bit about, the unique experience that it was coming up there and what it's meant for you, in the last couple of decades to be able to revisit the island now that it's back open and connect with other people who, like yourself, had this very unique experience.
Well, unfortunately for me, much of that is past. When when I was first able to go back to the island with my father in 1973, that was very good because I was able to experience the inside of the prison with him. Prior to that, one of the things that every kid wanted to do, and fortunately I was able to do it, and that's a story to itself. I was in the military. I joined the Air Force. I did not want to go into the Navy. I did not want to become a correctional officer. I did not want to become a police officer. That is a very, very tough job, and I take my hat off to anybody that does those jobs. I went a different way. But when I turned 21, which was the requirement for the Bureau of Prisons to tour the prison while it was still in operation, it was not closed down at that time. That was in 1961. I had to leave, and I came home to San Francisco. And fortunately for me, the warden at the time was Warden Madigan. Well, Warden Madigan's daughter had happened to marry my cousin, who was an officer on the island that I mentioned earlier. That's a story to itself, too. They got married in 1951. And so it was an easy task for me to call and get permission to get a tour of the island. So I went back to Alcatraz and toured it while it was still there. And so that was a unique experience that I had. In answer to your question, I learned early on that there was very little difference between the inmate and the officer. As I mentioned to you earlier, I did a study, and there was a very little age difference, maybe 1 or 2 years average age difference between the folks. So when our association was created and we were able to stay together all those years from 1965 on, we didn't invite inmates to those. Those were just family members for all those years. When it opened in 1980, late 80s with the Park Service, I was able to make connection with inmates, which really helped my experience because that just added to it. In all those years of having yearly picnics, and of course at my particular age now, most if not all, I can only count on one hand the few friends I still have from my time frame there. They've all passed away. So that part has been kind of sad. And the very first time I did go to the island in 1973, it was dramatic because the federal government had knocked the buildings down that I lived in. It was a blow to the chest, really. From that time on, the island was not like the island I lived on, and it's become less and less to date because my friends have passed away. So I just got to a point to where I just tell stories and try to pass on that the island was a very special place to live, but it wasn't mystical like Hollywood has it.
If you had the opportunity now, someone said to you, you can move back there and live there again, would you do it?
If it was possible, I'd do it in an instant for the fishing. But unfortunately, the Park Service has not let me go back and fish. So if I couldn't fish, I probably wouldn't go back. Secondarily, you do have to understand one of the reasons the island was closed down was because of the cost. We dumped all our sewage in the bay. We dumped our garbage in the bay. At least that was part of the facility at the time. And so it would be very, very difficult to live on that rock today, even if you could. The Army drilled down 300 feet, and it was solid rock. They could find no water. So while if it was a dream, sure, it'd be fun to go back, but practicality says it never happened. And you know, if I couldn't have my friends, no, my island is gone. I just try to make people aware of what it was like. Now, you had mentioned, Caitlin, we haven't looked at any photographs at all, and you wanted to see what it was like when I lived there. So maybe I could show you a photograph?
Yeah, definitely. Whenever you have the time to, you can walk down through it and explain, what is what.
Can you see this? Or well, here's the photograph. This was the island in the 1950s. At that time, the structures were the most structures there for family members, about 60 families. These are A, B, and C building, which was built in 1941. That added bachelor quarters and some more new apartments to the island. This is the associate warden and warden's house right here. And these are cottages that were left over from the military days. This is the 64 building that I was talking about earlier that's right there from the dock. When I lived there, this was the primary residence. Prior to these new apartments being built, they were very limited. There were some buildings up by the prison where the actual residents lived very close to the prison. They had a different kind of life than we had. This was the way the island looked when I lived there. Okay? Up in the top side, which we call the top side, this is the prison, this is the lighthouse, and there were 3 two-story duplexes around the lighthouse, and this is the warden's house. At the time I lived there, that were the buildings that existed there. There were some military buildings down from the warden's house that the early officers had lived in, but they were taken down. So this is a great view of the lighthouse facility and the warden's house when it was in its prime. Okay. This is a color picture of the new apartments. The new apartments right here, A, B, and C building. When I was a baby, I lived up here in the top floor. My sister tells me that we lived below the solarium. And during World War I, military came out there and had gun emplacements on top of the building. My sister told me stories about hearing them roll dice all night, as part of the military. This is the associate warden and captain's house. It's a split 2-story duplex. By the way, on the back here, this is our store. We had a store. This is a picture of the store. And it was a nice little store maintained by the officers, and so we could buy small goods there. Well, canned goods like, all canned goods like beans, pork and beans, and anything canned. They had some fresh stuff that came in too, periodically meats, and just a very small store, like maybe a 7-Eleven or something. Here's some of my friends. This is a picture when I was there. And I'm kind of hidden in the back here somewhere, right here. But this is an age group. Usually the kids that you did things with were a couple of years younger and a couple of years older. But virtually all these people in the picture are now gone. So that's my friends. And let's see here. This will give you a real good idea of the kids. I put me there because I can identify it for other people. I didn't put my name, I just said me because I show these pictures when I give talks. But this is a Sunday school or an Easter class, 1951. This is just my contemporaries, playing ball. What's that?
What's that?
I said it's great that you have so many of these items sort of of the time there.
Well, this is just scratching the surface, as Steve would tell you. This is the early days. This is when it first opened as a prison. And this is a kindergarten class. I have photos of various classes from church. They had various age groups. Again, to give an idea, it was a very small village in the middle of the bay. This is another idea of what it was like there. Young kids on one of the Rodman cannons that was still there when I lived there. There were 3. And the top picture shows snow on the roof. That's the warden's house with snow in 1962. Doesn't happen very often in San Francisco Bay. And just because we mentioned the early days, I really like this kind of information here. This was from the 1890s. And if you can get a close-up by blowing it up, these are kids dressed in various kind of costumes in the 1890s on Alcatraz, which is totally different than my experience. At this particular time, this was at the infancy of motors, so they can go to and from San Francisco. These folks that lived there in the 1860s and 70s and 80s had a different existence than we did in modern times. That's pretty much it for some photos.
When you come to collect all of these items, is it been through research, or is it more of a, you've been specifically looking for them, or they kind of come to you as you're around them?
No, it's a good question, Caitlin. As I mentioned earlier, when the Park Service asked us to come back to the island, I had just very close to retirement at that time. And I began to meet and get to know a whole lot of people that had lived there before and after me. And what I discovered was that the information was being lost. The stories, the photographs, the things that they had collected as family were being lost. So after I retired, my wife and I made it a point to go meet people that had lived on Alcatraz throughout the western states. And I collected stories and collected photos, and it just kept growing. And I did that for about 25 years. I'm still doing it a little bit now, but it kind of overwhelmed me. This is just a sampling of trying to save the history of Alcatraz that I became aware of. In addition to that, I had my friend Steve do a home movie of me on Alcatraz a number of years ago. I think it's 10 or 12 years ago. And it was just a home movie. One take, no documentary like some of the ones I've been on. And it turns out that has become kind of unique because the Park Service stopped you from being able to be out there when the public was there. And yet that was the most fun. I'd go out there, I'd tell stories, I'd gather a crowd and try to leave them with some feel of the island. So that's an outcome of that. My voice is beginning to go. We've been talking a long time. But that's become kind of unique now.
In the years you've been doing this, I think it's pretty abundantly clear that there is such a fascination with the island, with learning about the people that were there, being able to actually visit it. It's hands down one of the biggest attractions in this country. Why do you think there is such a fascination with Alcatraz?
Well, I've thought about that over the years because I've been asked. As I told you on the telephone, my son, who's a world traveler, he went a couple of years ago to the deep jungles of Venezuela and ran across some people down there that were locals, and they knew about Alcatraz, and that always amazed me because they were interested in Alcatraz from the deep jungles of Venezuela. So I've often thought that one of the reasons, are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
Sure.
My name is Charles Stucker. I go by Chuck. And I'm a month or so shy of being 78, so that means I'm 77.
Perfect.
Oh my God, I forgot to hit record.
Sorry, go ahead.
Rocky Chandler and Ed Falk and so forth. Having met Steve prior to that through his uncle, Willie Radke, number 666, as I mentioned to you on the phone, and I find his uncle to be really delightful. He was a former Alcatraz inmate. When these events came up and Rocky was going to be in town, or John Decker, former inmate, I put these things together not with any other idea but to capture the information at the time. And now the people have passed on. So the intent of these particular movies that I had Steve do for me was just to gather information. I just wanted to know the background on that. So.
Gotcha. Okay.
This is the first picture of the island.